The heavy clang of the metal handcuffs echoed sharply in the small, stale courtroom, reverberating like a death knell in the ears of everyone present. Daniel Rigg, a man weathered by time and silence, sat motionless on the cold wooden bench, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. At 66, his face was a map of years, etched with lines that told stories no one cared to ask, eyes that carried the weight of unspoken battles, a quiet so thick it pressed against the walls like a physical force. The officers had approached him cautiously, wary of the quiet man whose reputation whispered warnings in the dusty corridors of this forgotten town. Daniel didn't resist. There was no flash of anger, no desperate struggle, just a stillness that unnerved those who watched. To the casual observer, he was nothing more than an old veteran, perhaps cracked by the ghosts of war, a relic swallowed by bitterness and grief. But beneath the surface of his stoic silence was a mind perpetually replaying memories sharp as a sniper's bullet, memories that no stranger could fathom. His arrest stemmed from an incident at a local gas station where the tension of a brief exchange had spiraled beyond control. Yet no one in this courtroom really wanted to understand what led to that moment. They saw only a grizzled old man accused of threats and disorderly conduct, a figure easily dismissed as a broken veteran, damaged goods no longer worthy of the honor once bestowed upon him. But Daniel's thoughts were elsewhere. In the deep recesses of his mind, he wasn't an old man being handcuffed. He was still in the desert heat, the weight of his rifle steady in his hands, eyes focused miles away on a distant target. The world had shifted beneath him countless times since then, but in these quiet moments, the battlefield was never far. The clash of gunfire, the faces of comrades lost, the burden of survival pressed down on him heavier than any chain. No one in the courtroom saw the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm exterior, an exhaustion born not from physical labor but from years of carrying invisible wounds. The silence that clung to him wasn't surrender. It was the protective shell of a man who had long ago learned that words could never capture the complexity of what he endured. To speak meant to risk being misunderstood, to expose the raw vulnerability that his hardened shell tried desperately to conceal. Around him, the murmurs of the townspeople blended with the shuffling of papers and the dull thud of footsteps. They were spectators to a scene that felt all too familiar, another veteran cast aside, caught in the relentless grind of a society quick to forget. Daniel Rigg was reduced to a cautionary tale, a name whispered with a mix of pity and fear, while the true depths of his story lay buried beneath layers of silence and misunderstanding. As the bailiff read the charges, Daniel's gaze remained steady, eyes distant but unyielding. In that courtroom, he was both prisoner and witness to a system that had failed to see him as a man who had given everything. The handcuffs might hold his wrists, but they could not restrain the memories that shaped him, nor the dignity he carried in the quiet defiance of his stillness. The courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting shifting shadows on Daniel's worn features as his mind drifted back, far beyond the present moment and the cold metal cuffs. The sterile air of the courthouse dissolved, replaced by the sweltering heat of a desert that had become both a prison and a refuge. His memories were a labyrinth, tangled and jagged, fragments of a past no one wanted to revisit. A past erased from the headlines, buried beneath medals that gathered dust in forgotten drawers. Before the arrest, before the whispers and the judgment, there was a young man, a boy really, who had stepped onto a plane bound for a war zone, full of raw hope and a desperate need to prove he belonged. Daniel remembered the way the sun burned his neck as the helicopter lifted off, the acrid smell of gunpowder mingling with sweat and fear. He recalled the camaraderie, the shared laughter between men facing death daily, the fleeting moments of normalcy in a place that was anything but normal. But war did not grant kindness. It ripped innocence apart with brutal efficiency, trading youthful dreams for shattered bodies and haunted minds. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted Daniel's nights, ghosts that crowded his small apartment long after the medals had been pinned and the speeches forgotten. He carried their silence like a shroud, each loss a weight pressing deeper into his chest. When he returned, The world outside had moved on without him. The cheers that greeted some were muted or absent for others. Daniel found himself adrift in a society that viewed veterans as burdens or ghosts, specters of violence that reminded civilians of uncomfortable truths. His own family recoiled from the changes they saw in him, the shadows behind his eyes, the sudden flinches at loud noises, the conversations he couldn't hold because memories clawed their way to the surface unbidden. The government had programs, pamphlets promising help, but Daniel found the silence of his mind louder than any voice of support. Therapy sessions felt like betrayal. Admitting weakness was another battle he wasn't sure he wanted to fight. Instead, he buried himself in routine, working odd jobs that chipped away at his dignity but kept him afloat. He learned to mask the tremors beneath a calm facade, to swallow his pain so it wouldn't spill over onto others. His neighbors saw only the quiet man who rarely spoke, who kept to himself, whose eyes betrayed nothing but resignation. They didn't see the nights when the nightmares ripped him from sleep, the hours spent replaying a single moment in the sand where he'd failed to save a friend. Nor did they hear the hollow sound of his own voice when he whispered apologies into the darkness. That day at the gas station, the tension that boiled over was not just a clash of strangers, but a spark igniting a deeper, unresolved storm inside him. The simple act of asking for help had morphed into confrontation, a reminder of his isolation and the fragile grip he held on control. The frustration that surfaced was not anger at the world, but a desperate plea to be seen, not as a broken veteran, not as a threat, but as a man still fighting battles no one could understand. His arrest was a sentence, not just from the law, but from a society that preferred to forget, to push aside those who carried invisible wounds. Daniel Rigg was a man caught between worlds, the past and present colliding in a painful clash of identity and survival. The courtroom's sterile walls echoed with the silence of stories left untold, the weight of a forgotten past that shaped every breath he took. Yet, beneath the layers of pain and memory, a fragile thread of hope lingered, an unspoken desire for redemption, for understanding, for a chance to reclaim the dignity war had stolen. It was this quiet resilience, buried deep within him, that would define the next chapter of his life, even as the world watched with indifference. The courtroom was meant to be a place of order, where truth unfolded neatly, confined within the polished wood of the benches and the scripted voices of attorneys. But as Daniel sat at the defense table, hands trembling slightly beneath the surface, it became clear that nothing about this would be neat. On paper, his case was simple: a public disturbance, minor assault, resisting arrest. Open and shut. But papers didn't carry memories, and no legal summary could contain the weight of what Daniel carried inside. The prosecutor, a young man with precise diction and a clean suit that hadn't seen a day of real dirt, laid out the charges methodically. He described Daniel as uncooperative, aggressive, potentially dangerous, a threat. The narrative was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of the man it was supposedly about. To him, Daniel was just a file number with behavioral irregularities, a case to resolve before lunch. Daniel watched, numbly detached, as the words landed like soft, indifferent blows. He didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by men who bled beside him. But what hurt wasn't the accusation, it was the echo of silence that followed. No one in the courtroom knew who he had been before the war. No one seemed to care. The court reporter's fingers moved briskly across the keys, catching words while missing meaning. His public defender, Ms. Layla Mendez, was younger than he expected, but there was something in her eyes that paused Daniel's descent into despair. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, as if trying to peel back the layers of his silence. When she finally rose to speak, her voice didn't thunder. It didn't demand. It invited. She spoke not just of the incident, but of the man behind it. She introduced Daniel not as a criminal, but as a former staff sergeant with commendations for valor. A man who had saved lives, buried friends, and returned to a world that no longer made room for his pain. She didn't excuse what he had done. He hadn't asked her to, but she offered context, and in that courtroom, context was a form of resistance. a refusal to let him disappear into the folds of a legal process too eager to forget him. Still, the judge seemed unmoved. A man nearing retirement, his expression was carved in stone, his gavel more a symbol of routine than justice. He asked procedural questions, glanced at the clock, shuffled papers. It was just another case in a long, forgettable line. But then something shifted. During a brief recess, a woman from the gallery approached Layla. She was older, with silver streaks in her tightly braided hair, and her eyes held the quiet exhaustion of someone who'd lived too many lives. She introduced herself as Carla Haynes, a former Army medic who had served in Daniel's unit. She hadn't seen him in years. She had come by chance, noticing his name on the docket while accompanying a neighbor. But now that she was here, she couldn't stay silent. When court resumed, Layla requested to reopen witness testimony. The judge hesitated, sighed, but relented. Carla took the stand. Her voice cracked at first, but then steadied, anchored by a fierce clarity. She spoke of a mission gone wrong, of an ambush that left 4 men dead and Daniel crawling back with shrapnel in his shoulder and another soldier across his back. She spoke of how command had promised counseling, support, how none of it came. She recounted how Daniel used to sit in silence after the war, staring into space like he was still dodging bullets. She described his descent into isolation, not as failure, but as fallout. The courtroom changed then. It didn't transform entirely, systems don't shift in a single testimony, but the air thickened with something real. The silence became charged. The judge no longer fidgeted. The prosecutor no longer looked bored. Even the bailiff's posture changed subtly, his grip on routine loosened by the tremor of truth. Carla's words didn't erase what happened at the gas station. They didn't absolve Daniel, but they reframed the narrative. They offered the courtroom something rarely given: humanity. As she stepped down, Daniel looked at her, and something inside him cracked open. Not brokenness, but the beginning of release. Not all chains are metal. Some are woven from guilt, grief, and solitude. And hers was the first voice to cut through the noise. The judge asked for a recess. The proceedings would not end that day after all. What was meant to be quick had become complicated. What was supposed to be routine now demanded reflection. Daniel sat in the silence of the emptying courtroom, no longer a man passing unnoticed. His story had been heard, not completely, not yet, but enough to unsettle the rhythm of forgetting. And sometimes, that's all it takes to begin again. The courtroom was quieter after Carla's testimony, but it wasn't the silence of disinterest anymore. It was the taut, uneasy hush of people reevaluating what they thought they knew. Even the judge's expression, previously granite, had acquired the faintest crease of contemplation. The session was in recess, yet no one had truly left the room emotionally. Something had shifted. The story had outgrown its file. Daniel remained seated, still as stone, his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. Carla's words were still echoing in his chest, resonating in chambers long sealed. He had not spoken to her in nearly a decade. He had not spoken to anyone about that day in Sanjin province for even longer. The courtroom lights didn't feel quite so harsh now, but the weight of being seen, truly seen, pressed into him like an unfamiliar pressure. Then came the footsteps. Not hurried, not tentative. Steady. Purposeful. The type of footsteps that belonged to someone who was used to walking into rooms and having them fall silent. The doors opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped in, flanked by 2 aides. His presence was immediate, commanding. His posture straight, his stride unapologetic. At first glance, he might have been mistaken for a politician or corporate magnate, until the courtroom clerk froze for a beat and whispered something to the judge. That name, General Eleanor Beckett, passed like a low current through the room. Daniel didn't raise his head. Not yet. But something inside him tightened. General Beckett was a legend in military circles. A 4-star general. Decorated. Feared. Respected. He had commanded entire theaters of operation, made decisions that shifted international balances, and now, for reasons unknown, he was here, standing quietly in the back of a small municipal courtroom, watching a case that had previously been marked as low priority on the docket. Layla turned to the judge, uncertain. Even she, seasoned in advocacy and composed under pressure, faltered for a moment. "Your Honor," the general said finally, his voice calm and crisp, aged but strong. "I'd like to request to speak." The courtroom fell entirely still. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, then flicked to the name tag the clerk had just handed him. "General Beckett, you are not listed as a witness." "No, sir," Beckett replied. "But I am a material observer, and I believe I can shed light on matters relevant to this court's understanding of Mr. Daniel Rowe." Daniel's head lifted at last. His eyes met the general's across the room, just for a moment. And in that look, something passed between them. Not warmth, not nostalgia, something older, heavier. Permission was granted. The general approached the stand without notes. He did not swear in with hesitation. His oath sounded like a promise made to the dead. "I knew Staff Sergeant Daniel Rowe," he began, "when I was leading operations in the Middle East. He was one of ours. Not under my direct command, but known to me, not because of heroism, but because of what followed." He paused, not for effect, but for memory. In war, decisions are made that live far beyond their context. In Sanjin province, our intelligence was flawed. We sent a small unit into a region we believed cleared. It wasn't. Rowe's unit was ambushed. Half were killed. Communications failed. But Rowe, he did something most don't come back from. He carried a fellow soldier 3 kilometers under fire with a collapsed lung and shrapnel in his back. He was never the same after that. And he looked down, jaw tightening, we never followed up. There was a fracture in the general's voice now, barely perceptible but real. Daniel was recommended for a citation. It was denied. Not for lack of merit, but because higher command feared the exposure of our flawed intel. He was quietly discharged 2 years later with a thank you letter and no trauma support. I was briefed. I signed the papers. The room held its breath. I came today because when I saw his name on the docket, I realized this wasn't just a man falling through the cracks. This was a man we pushed. Daniel sat frozen. He had buried that part of his story so deep, even he no longer knew where it started. Hearing Beckett speak wasn't just vindication, it was a shattering. The general, once an untouchable figure cloaked in military myth, was here, unraveling decades of silence in front of strangers. The judge leaned back, visibly unsettled. The prosecutor sat still, blinking, caught between legal procedure and something that felt alarmingly like moral obligation. But the courtroom wasn't the only thing transformed. Inside Daniel, the narrative he had carried, the one where he was forgotten, discarded, irrelevant, was beginning to fracture. Shame and fury, his twin companions, now had company. A witness. An echo of accountability from a man who had once only existed as a name behind a curtain. The session adjourned shortly after. No verdict was handed down. The judge said he needed time. Time to consider new testimony. Time to think. It was the first moment Daniel Rowe had truly been granted time since he returned home from war. As he exited the courtroom, Layla walked beside him in silence. She didn't speak, didn't congratulate, didn't fill the air. And for once, Daniel didn't feel the need to disappear. He glanced back briefly and saw the general still standing alone, hands clasped in front of him, watching, waiting, perhaps, for a weight to lift that never would. Some truths don't fix the past. They just let the healing begin. Daniel hadn't slept the night after the general's testimony. Not truly. His body had rested, but his mind remained alert, circling old wounds with the cautious fingers of someone who had spent years pretending they didn't exist. Beckett's words had cracked something in him, and once a crack begins, it never stays still. Grief seeps in. Memory leaks out. He sat by the window of his temporary holding room, watching the first light of morning stretch across the floor like a cautious visitor. Layla had told him yesterday that new documents had surfaced, evidence she had pushed for after Carla's statement, but she hadn't shared more. She'd said she wanted him to be the first to read it, and that alone had unsettled him more than any charge he faced. The knock on the door was soft. She entered without waiting for a reply, carrying a manila envelope and an unreadable expression. Her usual fire had been tempered into something quieter, not sadness, but gravity. She handed him the envelope wordlessly. He didn't open it right away. His hands lingered over the sealed edge, fingers tracing the fold as if they could guess its contents through touch alone. Then, slowly, he peeled it open and withdrew a set of documents. A typed report, a letter, and something handwritten on military stationery, yellowed with age, edges frayed. The first document was cold and bureaucratic, an internal investigation summary. It referenced the failed mission in Sanjin province, Operation Nomad Dust. But it wasn't just about tactical failure or intelligence lapses. It detailed a cover-up. Redactions littered the page, but enough remained to form a truth he had only suspected in passing. They had known. Days before the ambush, an informant had flagged the area as compromised. The warning never reached Daniel's unit, because someone had buried it. The second paper was more personal, a letter drafted by a junior officer who had attempted to expose the suppression. The letter never reached Daniel. It had been intercepted, filed away, and only now unearthed through legal channels Layla had accessed with Beckett's help. But the third document, the handwritten one, was what destroyed him. It was from a soldier in his unit, Corporal Jensen. Daniel's breath caught in his throat at the name. Jensen had been the youngest, barely 20, shot through the abdomen and dead before the medevac arrived. Or so Daniel had believed. The letter was dated 4 months after Sanjin. It was never sent, just a draft, scrawled in aching, messy script. Dan, asterisk if you're reading this, then something must have gone right. I don't know if I'll get the chance to talk to you again. After the op, I ended up at Bagram. They kept me under wraps. Said it was for my safety. But it wasn't. They didn't want anyone to know I made it. Didn't want word getting out about what we walked into. I heard things. About the brass. About how intel was suppressed. About how you carried me. Carried all of us in one way or another. They wanted me quiet. And I think they'll keep me that way. I don't know what they'll tell you. But if you're still out there, I want you to know you weren't wrong. You weren't crazy. You saved my life, and even if I don't make it, I want someone to remember that. Asterisk. You're the bravest son of a bitch I ever knew. Forgive them if you can. But don't ever forget. Jensen. Daniel's hands trembled. The letter fell into his lap. He couldn't breathe. Jensen hadn't died in the field. He had survived. At least for a while. And then he had been silenced, not by a bullet, but by a system that could not afford the truth. The narrative Daniel had carried for years, that he had failed Jensen, that Jensen had died in his arms, was a lie fed by omission. And worse, his guilt had been cultivated by design. His mind spiraled. Every sleepless night, every drink taken to forget, every wall he built between himself and the world, all of it rooted in a falsehood designed to bury shame, but not his. Theirs. Layla sat across from him, watching the storm play out in his silence. You needed to see it, she said softly. Not just for the case. For yourself. Daniel nodded, barely. The floor beneath his memories was gone now. Nothing solid remained. But there was a strange, raw freedom in that collapse. If Jensen had lived, even briefly, if Daniel's trauma was not madness but memory distorted by betrayal, then perhaps the man he used to be wasn't as far gone as he thought. Perhaps he had been grieving a ghost fabricated by institutional cowardice. He stood slowly, the letter still in hand. The past wasn't something he could undo. The dead were still dead. The war still happened. But now, at least, there was clarity. Do they know? He asked Layla. The court. The judge. They will, she replied. But first I thought you should. For the first time in years, Daniel Rowe felt something stir in the hollow where certainty used to live. Not hope, not yet, but direction. A compass freed from false north. He turned to the window again. The morning sun was higher now. The light reached his face. Tomorrow they would return to court. And this time, he would not sit as a broken man trying to explain his ghosts. This time, He would speak as someone whose silence had been weaponized and who was ready, finally, to fight back. The courtroom was silent in that strange, suspended way, like a theater before the first line is spoken, or a church before confession. The air carried the weight of something imminent, though no one yet understood its shape. The prosecution sat stiffly, aware that the defense had submitted new evidence, sealed overnight, labeled urgent. The judge, a man known more for his rigid adherence to procedure than for surprises, looked weary but expectant. Daniel Rowe walked in without handcuffs this time. A small change, procedural perhaps, but it did something to the room. He walked straighter. Not proud, never that, but no longer hollow. Layla moved beside him with a measured grace, carrying the sealed documents and a face unreadable as stone. The trial had, by every indication, been tilting toward a quiet conviction. A man with a record of psychological instability. A tragic past. A violent act. The narrative had been clean. Neat. Painless for the public, who preferred their stories with clear villains and swift endings. But that morning, everything began to unravel, not in chaos, but with a slow, almost surgical precision. Layla requested a hearing to present newly discovered exculpatory evidence. The prosecution objected, then recanted upon seeing the judge's narrowed eyes. Permission was granted. She began not with the documents, but with a name. Corporal Andrew Jensen. The name hung in the air, alien to most in the room, but not to Daniel. He looked down, his hands folded tightly in his lap, as if holding something fragile. Layla walked to the center of the room like someone preparing to conduct electricity. Her voice was calm, but carried with it the density of accumulated truths. For over a decade, my client believed he had failed to save this young soldier. Believed that Jensen had died in his arms after a botched mission in Sanjin province. That belief shaped every moment of his life since. What you will hear today is not simply about a war crime or a legal technicality. It is about how institutional silence shapes the soul of a man. She handed the documents to the judge and asked to read excerpts aloud. Permission was granted. First came the internal investigation report, redacted lines, timelines that did not match public records, buried alerts. Then, the letter from the junior officer. A quiet attempt to reach Rowe with the truth that never left the military filing cabinet. The courtroom leaned in, breath caught, as words like suppression, retaliation, and disinformation were spoken aloud under oath. And then came the letter. Jensen's voice. Layla didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves, ragged, young, afraid, brave. The courtroom was utterly silent. A clerk wiped away a tear. The prosecutor's lips were pressed thin, face drained of certainty. When she finished, Layla stepped back. This man, she said, turning to Daniel, has lived with a ghost weaponized against him. This letter, this truth, is not a loophole, it's the key to everything. The judge didn't respond at first. He stared at the documents like they had altered gravity itself. But Daniel stood then unprompted. It wasn't procedural. It wasn't even wise, perhaps. But it was human. Your Honor, he said, voice gravel and wind. I don't care if I go free. That's not why I'm here. But for the first time since Sanjin, I know I wasn't insane. I carried those boys through fire. I carried Jensen thinking he died in my arms. But he didn't. And someone decided I should know that. So when I came home and started losing myself, that wasn't just PTSD. That was grief corrupted by lies. That was guilt engineered. He paused. Not for effect. Just to breathe. I don't need sympathy. But I won't let them write my story in pencil anymore. The judge watched him for a long moment. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment. It had become something else, a sanctuary for the reckoning of a truth long silenced. Then the judge finally spoke, voice even but softer than usual. This court will recess for 36 hours to allow full examination of the submitted evidence. The charges against the defendant are not dismissed, but the motion for a mistrial is under consideration. Defense counsel, Your request to unseal military personnel records tied to this case is granted. It wasn't exoneration. Not yet. But it was the turning of the tide. As they walked out of the courtroom, Layla looked at Daniel, not as his lawyer, but as someone who had just watched a man drag a mountain off his chest and stand taller for it. That, she said quietly, was history. Daniel didn't smile. He couldn't yet, but he felt something shift deep inside. A door opening in the dark. Maybe the world still didn't know the whole story. But now, finally, it wanted to. For 36 hours, Daniel Rowe existed in a liminal space, no longer on trial, not yet absolved. The hotel room the court had arranged for him felt like a waiting room between lives. He sat by the window most of the time, not reading, not watching TV, just letting the silence fall over him like fresh snow, muting everything. The world didn't feel real yet. Not with the documents laid bare, not with Jensen's letter echoing in his blood. It would take more than paper and permission to undo 15 years of grief crystallized into guilt. Layla came to him that evening, her usual fire dulled into something quieter. Not defeat, something closer to reverence. She had spent the day sifting through the military's sealed records, poring over files that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. What she found was worse than she had expected, and precisely what Daniel had feared. "They buried you on purpose," she said, placing a folder on the coffee table. "They created the story that made you a villain in your own life." Daniel didn't answer. His hands gripped the sides of the chair like he might drift away otherwise. Intelligence came in 4 days before the ambush. It was clear, unambiguous. The mission should have been pulled, but someone higher up, Colonel Hastings, overrode the alert, claimed the informant was compromised. He was wrong, dead wrong. Her voice hardened. And when it all went sideways, when your team was wiped out and you came back broken but asking questions, they made sure to label you unstable. The reports, the language they used to describe you, it wasn't medical. It was tactical. You were a liability, not a patient. Daniel stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. "Why now?" he asked, voice low. "Why would any of this come out now?" Layla hesitated. Then she sat across from him, arms resting on her knees. "Because Carla James, the woman who testified, she lost her son in Sanjin too. Not in your unit, but in a similar op just weeks later. Same suppression tactics. Same command chain. She recognized your name when you were arrested and started digging. She didn't know if you were innocent, but she knew something was off. And she knew what it felt like to be handed a folded flag and a lie." Daniel closed his eyes. A mother's grief had reopened a sealed vault. A dead soldier's unsent letter had cracked open the narrative. And now, for the first time, the truth was in the open air, ugly, undeniable, but free. When court reconvened, the gallery was more crowded than before. Journalists had begun to take interest. Veterans. A few suits from D.C. whose presence said more than they intended. Judge Monroe took his seat like a man who understood the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't bother with preamble. After reviewing the newly presented evidence, including military records previously sealed under national security pretenses, the court finds that a miscarriage of justice has occurred, both in the events preceding the trial and in the manner in which the defendant was charged. There was a ripple in the courtroom. Not noise, just movement. People shifting in their seats as if history were passing through them. The court cannot, at this moment, issue a complete exoneration. But the charges against Mr. Rowe are hereby dropped, and the case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this court recommends that the Department of Defense launch a full investigation into Operation Nomad Dust and its command oversight. Layla didn't look at Daniel. She didn't have to. The courtroom broke into quiet murmurs, some of relief, some of awe, some of long-held pain resurfacing. A woman in the second row, older, dressed in gray, pressed a hand to her mouth, weeping silently. Daniel didn't know her, but he knew what she had lost. They all did. He stood. Not tall, not proud, just present. And alive. Outside the courthouse, the cameras swarmed. Microphones shoved forward like bayonets. Layla fielded most of them, shielded him with practiced grace. But one question found its way through the crowd, sharp and honest. "Mr. Rowe, do you believe justice has been served?" Daniel looked up into the lights, blinking. "I believe," he said, "that justice doesn't heal. It only tells the truth. What you do with that truth, that's what matters." And then he walked away. No dramatic exit. No fist in the air. Just a man stepping out from beneath 15 years of shadow into whatever came next. Behind him, the world was beginning to reckon with a lie it had lived with far too long. Ahead, the path was uncertain. But this time, Daniel Rowe would walk it standing. Months had passed since the courtroom doors last shut behind Daniel Rowe. In the absence of flashbulbs and headlines, in the stillness that followed Justice's reluctant exhale, he found himself not celebrating, but adjusting. Healing was not a crescendo, it was the slow, uneven return of sensation in a limb you thought you'd lost. He had moved to a quiet coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, where fog greeted the mornings and the sea held more memory than noise. He rented a modest cottage near the cliffs. The walls were bare. He didn't hang medals, didn't unpack the few boxes that came with him. Everything he needed he carried inside, and most of it was still heavy. Each morning he walked the beach. Not for fitness, not out of habit, but because there was something sacred about the tide's rhythm, how it came and went, indifferent to human triumphs or failures. It reminded him that time didn't owe anyone meaning. You had to carve it out yourself. He spoke little to the locals. A few nods at the general store, the occasional shared silence at a pier. It was enough. Words had once been used to bury him. Now, he chose them with reverence or not at all. One morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just his name in tight cursive. Inside, a photograph, faded, creased, of him with his unit, arms slung over each other's shoulders, sunburned and laughing. On the back, scrawled in pen, "You brought us home." Whatever they said after we knew. J. He stared at the handwriting for a long time. Not with shock, not with pain. Just quiet recognition. Jensen hadn't written from the grave. He was gone. But someone had sent the photo. Someone who'd wanted Daniel to remember the version of himself that hadn't been swallowed whole. He placed the photograph on the small mantel above the fireplace, not as decoration but as evidence. Not all ghosts needed burying. Some needed witnessing. Later that evening, he sat at the old desk by the window and opened a fresh notebook. He hadn't written in years, not properly. The first words came haltingly, awkward. But then they flowed. Not a memoir, not a manifesto, just a letter. To anyone. To no one. To the boy he'd been. To the soldiers who never came back. To the country that sent them and forgot them. You think the worst thing is to die at war. It's not. The worst thing is to come back and realize no one knew you were still fighting. They gave me a flag. A pension. A silence that felt like erasure. But I remember everything. The way they laughed in the dark. The way we knew each other without needing to speak. The way we were used and then discarded like outdated maps. I don't want revenge. I don't even want recognition. I just want to live the rest of my days without having to convince anyone that my pain was real. He paused, pen hovering, and then added one final line. If you find this, whoever you are, know that silence is never neutral. It either protects power or it honors the broken. Choose well. He tore out the page and tucked it into the back of the photograph frame. Maybe someone would find it someday. Maybe not. But it was enough that it had been written. That night, he stood by the open window, wind brushing against his skin like the first time he stepped off a chopper and smelled dust and adrenaline. But this wind carried no death. Just salt and fog and space. Daniel Rowe was not healed. Healing wasn't a destination. But he was free. And for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of war.